Past Sins, Chapter 12, Mother of a Nightmare. I can't believe Nick's turned out to be Nightmare Moon. It just makes about as much sense as a blue apple, Applejack commented. I can't believe you were in on it the whole time and didn't tell us, Rainbow Dash snapped while pointing an accusing hoof at Rarity. Rarity sat defensively and scrunched up her nose. Do not take that tone with me, Rainbow Dash. Twilight made me promise not to tell. What was I supposed to do? Betray her trust? Besides, we did not believe Nyx was a threat. Or haven't you noticed Twilight is upstairs and has been crying her eyes out since Nightmare Moon disappeared? Her tone softened, and she looked up to the library staircase. I had to carry the poor thing all the way back here and tuck her into bed. Do you think she will be all right? Fluttershy asked. I don't know, Rarity admitted. Twilight is taking what happened very hard. I'd be more surprised if she didn't. She loved that little filly like she was her own. I try to cheer her up, but right now, but the only way I know how to cheer up other ponies is with parties, and Twilight doesn't need a party right now, Pinkie Pie said, her voice lacking much of its usual enthusiasm. No, she doesn't, Rarity agreed. Right now, Twilight just needs some time. But I'm sure she'll be back on her hooves soon. She'd better, Rainbow Dash growled in agitation as she hovered above her friends' heads. Nightmare Moon is alive. That means we need to stop her again, and we can't use the elements of harmony without Twilight. Rainbow! Shh! Twilight'll hear you, Applejack scolded. Still, the five friends didn't realize how well their voices carried the old tree. Despite their speaking in hushed voices, their words were able to bounce all the way upstairs to reach into the bedroom and Twilight's ears. Twilight was in bed, and her eyes were red from crying. She laid on top of the covers and hugged a ripped purple vest, a bent headband, and a pair of cracked glasses to her chest as she looked out the window at the distant moon. Those 3 items were all that had been left in the center of Ponyville after Nyx became Nightmare Moon, and Twilight hugged these items to her chest as tightly as she could. But they offered her no comfort. They were no substitute for the little filly Twilight desperately desired to hold. Twilight knew why she had done it, why she had been willing to let Celestia take Nyx away, and the truth was tearing up Twilight's insides like a parasprite in a basket of apples. Princess Celestia. She was the princess and her mentor. Some would argue she treated the princess like a second mother, considering how close they had gotten while she was at school. And when one of the ponies you trust in the world above all else, a pony who always seems to be right, tell you a filly you're caring for needs to be taken away, part of you wants to agree. Twilight had tried to argue, but Princess Celestia didn't waver. It was like she was trying to move the sun itself, an impossible task. So part of Twilight submitted, part of her agreed with what Princess Celestia was saying and shut down. The logical part of her brain conceded, even though the other parts of her were screaming for her to keep up the fight. She had just shut down and become shell-shocked. Then Nyx called out to her. Called out for her mother. And all too late, Twilight realized what an idiot she was being. She tried to catch up, tried to stop the princess, but she and Nyx were already gone, and now all she had left of the filly she cared for were a few pieces of clothing, and she hugged those things as tightly as she could to her chest. But those things would never replace Nyx. There was only one thing Twilight desired more than having Nyx back. She wanted to say she was sorry. She wanted to say those words whether or not she was forgiven. Yet there was only one pony those words would mean anything to, and Twilight had no clue where Nightmare Moon was. She had vanished. Despite an all-out search by the equestrian army, Nightmare Moon and the cult had left no clues behind. It was like they had just disappeared into thin air, which was an accurate description of the teleportation spell that was cast. Twilight herself had tried a number of spells to locate Nightmare Moon. Scrying spells, locator spells, they all failed. She could only guess that the cult was purposefully masking Nightmare Moon's location to keep Celestia and Luna from finding out where they had hidden themselves.
Hey, didn't I tell you who that spy was?
Pinkie Pie's voice echoed from the library's main floor, drawing Twilight's attention back to eavesdropping on her friend's conversation.
Spy? What spy?
Applejack asked.
The spy at the Learn and Play Day,
Rainbow Dash answered.
Pinkie Pie chased him around till he used the stair to make her freeze up.
Pinkie Pie nodded her head.
Yeah, and you know who it was? That waiter pony from the cafe in town, Hort Cuisine. I saw him standing with all those nasty cult ponies, and I recognized his mane and those creepy, weepy turquoise eyes of his. Pinkie, they all had turquoise eyes,
Fluttershy pointed out.
I know, but I could still tell it was him. When he recognized me, my nose got scratchy, my ears got floppy, and that means some pony recognized me, and he was the only one looking at me.
Applejack sighed and shook her head.
Well, shoot. Makes you wonder how many other ponies around town here were working for that crazy cult. Yes, it does, Applejack, and I'm sure we'll find out the extent of that particular poison in the morning, Rarity huffed. I'd rather not even think about it right now, personally.
Rainbow Dash said something after that, but Twilight didn't listen to it. Her attention was on her magic. With her horn glowing, she stuffed her saddlebags with a number of different items. She then pushed open her bedroom window, jumped out onto the small balcony, and levitated herself down to the street below before galloping off into the night. Within minutes, Twilight had made her way to Hort Cuisine's home. The waiter, Stallion, and Bachelor lived a few blocks from the restaurant where he worked, a fact Twilight knew from when she needed to retrieve an overdue library book from him. Twilight approached the front door, and made no effort to be stealthy or discreet as she used magic to force her way inside. The home looked positively pleasant. It was warm, welcoming, and very clean. Not at all the kind of home Twilight would expect a cultist to live in. The decor of Hort's home, however, wasn't Twilight's concern. She made her way upstairs into the home's one bedroom. She then moved over to the bed and magically opened her saddlebags. From inside the bags, a number of items floated into the air under the gentle caress of Twilight's magic. An enchanted map of Equestria, a few smooth stones, and a book. Skillful seeing, scrying, and searching spells all found their way onto the bed. After flipping open the book to the marked page, Twilight read the instructions while using the smooth stones to keep the map spread out across Hort's bed. She then set the book down and began to rummage through the room. She opened drawers, searched the closet, and ransacked the room for small pieces of jewelry, pictures, and anything that was both small and something a pony might call personal. Once she had a sizable cloud of random items floating around her head, Twilight looked down at the book and read the instructions on the spell again. She had the magically prepared map, and she had to have some of Hort's and she had to have some item of Hort's that was of great personal value. That would be enough to try and scry for the waiter's location. That was the single hope Twilight was clinging to. That, while Nightmare Moon was protected against scrying spells, the cultists were not. Levitating each item she had collected above the map, Twilight cast the scrying spell, and hoped it would lead her to Hort Cuisine. For most items, the spell had little to no effect, and any item that failed to work was quickly tossed aside. The item that finally gave Twilight a good reaction was an old pocket watch. When the scrying spell was cast upon it, a thin line of light formed between the watch and a place on the map. was a sight that made a smile blossom onto Twilight's face, for the scrying spell was pointed to an area near Ponyville. Quickly dropping all the other items, Twilight set the watch into the open bag before turning her head. Horn shimmering, she drew out another map from her bag. She set it on top of the previous map and kept its corners pinned down with the smooth stones. The new map was of Ponyville and the surrounding area, and once it was laid down on the bed, Twilight quickly cast a scrying enchantment on it. Then, with the new map prepared, Twilight grabbed the pocket watch of the book and cast a scrying spell again. The line of light was formed once more, and it pointed to the edge of town. Yet Twilight too noticed that the line was moving, which meant Hort Cuisine was on the move. Twilight leaned in close, and tracked Hort Cuisine as he moved farther away from Bowieville. And just as the line was starting to point to the area of the old gemstone quarries, the spell stopped working and the line disappeared. Twilight blinked a few times, and looked up at the pocket watch, wondering if she had done something wrong. She tried recasting the scrying spell, and the line flickered back into existence for a moment before disappearing again. There was only a hoofful of reasons the spell would work for one moment and stop working the next, and only one made sense to Twilight. The spell was being blocked. Eyes flashing, Twilight used a quill to mark the map where the last location with the scrying spell had pointed to before she quickly packed up her things. She got a direction to go and a hunch to act on, which was enough for her. She turned towards the door, not even glancing at the mess she was leaving. In fact, she smiled a little at the thought of Hort Cuisine coming back to find his bedroom had been ransacked. It was her small way of getting back at him for spying on her, her friends, and Nyx. Still, Twilight didn't let her mind linger on Hort Cuisine. The sun was starting to rise, and Twilight didn't want to run the risk of being caught by her friends or being stopped by any pony on the street. She was a pony on a mission, and with her eyes forward and her brow tucked down in determination, she began walking in the direction of the distant gem quarries.
Twilight, Sugar Cube, are you awake?
Applejack asked. Applejack and the others had decided to spend the night at the library. And just in case Twilight needed them or Nightmare Moon decided to attack. Each had slept through the night with their Element of Harmony necklace, and Spike assured them that Twilight's tiara was safely tucked away in her bedside table. It may not have been the best place to hide such an important artifact, but it was better than leaving it out in the open. Applejack saw a mound beneath the covers of the bed and drew close to it.
Sugar Cube, I know you're beating yourself up about what happened, but you can't just lie here moping. We gotta deal with Nightmare Moon before she can attack the princesses, and we can't do it without your help.
Twilight didn't reply, and after a few anxious moments, Applejack reached out a hoof to poke her friend to make sure she was awake. When her hoof sunk deeper into the covers of the bed than it should have, Applejack's eyes narrowed and she tore off the covers. Where Applejack thought Twilight had been lying was instead a few strategically placed pillows, and attached to it was one note.
By the time you read this, I will be long gone. There is something I have to do, and I won't let any of my friends or anybody else put themselves in danger trying to come with me. There are some things I have to say to get off my chest, and there is only one pony I can say them to. I do not know where I'm going, and I doubt that I will return. I don't expect every pony to understand why I'm doing this, but I have to see Nyx, my daughter, one more time. I have to tell her how sorry I am, even if she doesn't believe me. Sincerely, Twilight Sparkle.
Horse feathers! Applejack cursed. Twilight girl, what are you thinking? Twilight peeked around the corner and took note of the 2 guards standing in the earthen tunnel. After reaching the empty rock quarries outside Ponyville, It didn't take long for Twilight to figure out that she needed to head down into the elaborate tunnel network of the Diamond Dogs. Then, after a few hours of navigating corridors, she almost walked into a pair of patrolling guards. It had been a close call, but it also let Twilight know she was in the right place. The guards themselves were a twisted mockery of Princess Celestia's royal guard. The armor was of a similar build, but it was a nightmare blue. Midnight blue, like the armor worn by Nightmare Moon. Also, like Princess Celestia's soldiers, the armor was enchanted to change the appearance of the pony wearing it. The coats of the sturdily built stallions were a haunting, almost sickly gray tone, and they had Nightmare Moon's piercing eyes. After that close call, Twilight moved carefully through the tunnels to ensure that she avoided any wandering patrols. Now, however, Twilight faced a pair of guards that stood vigilantly at a door in the tunnels. She had no clue what was behind that door. It could be where Nightmare Moon was, or it could be a guard barracks filled with a whole platoon of armored soldiers. Twilight slipped back behind the corner and took a moment to swallow the nervous knot in her throat and shore up her courage. She then picked up a nearby loose gemstone with her magic and chucked it down the tunnel. The gemstone clattered against the stones, and the tinkling noise it made seemed to echo endlessly against the solid stone of the walls. Yet, after a few tense moments, the guards hadn't come to investigate. Twilight risked another peek around the corner, and saw the two unicorns hadn't moved an inch. They'd remained still as statues except for their ears, which were now turned forward and attentive. Her attempt to draw the guards away from the door did nothing but make them more alert, a little fact that made Twilight grit her teeth in aggravation. "Okay, time for another tactic," Twilight whispered as her horn started to glow. She'd have to do this quickly, but maybe it would work. Peeking out from behind the corner one more time, Twilight cast out her magic. The magic reached the door, and after taking a few moments to build up strength, unleashed itself. The heavy wooden door swung open violently and crashed against the stone wall on the far side. Despite their training, the two guards jumped at the sound, and quickly turned to see who would open the door so suddenly. Twilight too was looking through the door, but for another reason. First, she confirmed there were no guards on the other side. She then focused on the hallway beyond the door. She studied it, and painted a picture of it in her mind. She had to memorize every detail she could before the guards pulled the door shut and she was forced to duck back behind their corner. Twilight then waited, staying hidden to make sure the guards weren't coming to go searching for her. She waited a good few minutes, and then began to smile as she pictured the far side of the door in her head. She called her magic and disappeared with a flash. After she felt the teleportation spell finish, Twilight held her breath and kept her eyes shut. She feared for a moment that she may have aimed incorrectly and disappeared directly in front of the guards. Yet, when no pony reached out to grab her, she risked a look and smiled when she saw she teleported exactly where she wanted to be, the far side of the door. With the guards bypassed and a new trick for getting by any future obstacles, Twilight continued down the tunnel. It went straight for a long time before ending in a right turn, and upon reaching that bend, Twilight peeked around the corner and let out an almost audible gasp at what she saw. A huge cavern had been carved out of the solid rock. It stretched on for what had to be 20 or 30 stories, and was easily several city blocks wide across. Even more impressive was what was built in the cavern. A castle, both elegant and terrifying, had been erected in the deep underground cavern. Its tallest tower was just a few feet short of scraping the ceiling. Twilight had little doubt she had found the castle of Nightmare Moon, and was beginning to regret the fact that she hadn't brought her friends. Still, she quickly shook this fear from her mind. If she had brought her friends along, it would be to confront and defeat Nightmare Moon using the elements of harmony. and she couldn't be a part of that. That was why she hadn't come searching for Nightmare Moon. Not wanting to rush out haphazardly, Twilight hung in the back access tunnel and watched the many patrols of guards that kept watch from the castle's high walls. As if being underground wasn't enough, the castle still had defense walls, which only made Twilight's approach that much more difficult. She contemplated a dozen plans to get close to the castle, but each quickly became squashed by the patrol routes of the guards. Yet, Twilight then remembered the trick she had just used. The guards wouldn't be expecting a pony capable of teleporting, so Twilight began to look across the castle for any opening she could teleport into. The opening Twilight chose was a balcony on the tallest tower, and with a small flash, she used her magic to reach that balcony with a single teleport. She then used a chance to look back, both to make sure she hadn't been seen and to smile at the castle security she'd been able to bypass. She'd need to tell Princess Celestia about the trick if she made it back. Her mentor would undoubtedly like to know how easy it was for a pony to sneak into such a heavily guarded castle by just popping around using a teleportation spell. For the moment, however, Twilight shelved that thought and poked her head into the room their balcony was attached to. It seemed to be a room that existed only as a means of accessing the highest balcony of the castle, a room elegantly decorated with the nighttime sky on the ceiling and a map of Equestria on the floor. Otherwise, the room was completely devoid of any furniture. It seemed a shame to wear such a perfectly good room, but Twilight didn't think about it long before she moved across a nearby stairwell and made a descent into the rest of the castle. Twilight felt a lot less sure about what she was doing. Her progress through the castle was slow, mostly because she had to keep hiding from passing guards. That, and she had almost screamed when she came across a room filled with dismembered and broken training dummies that looked like her and her friends. Even now, thinking about that room caused Twilight to lift a hoof to her neck and swallow nervously. She was so happy she'd been able to avoid the castle guard so far. Yet, after letting another pair of guards pass and slipping out of a storage closet, Twilight was able to continue her way through the castle. The hallways were kept lit with a number of enchanted gemstones, though the gems themselves cast off an eerie light. Twilight could only imagine the precious jewels were an abundant resource in the tunnel network of the Diamond Dogs. It also made sense to use gems, since normal torches would quickly choke the castle and the cavern with smoke. These, however, were all side concerns. Twilight had been scouring the rooms for probably an hour with no sign of Nightmare Moon. The worst part of it was the fact that Nightmare Moon could also be moving around. For all Twilight knew, Nightmare Moon could be in a part of the castle she had already checked. That made the chances of her finding Nightmare Moon before she was discovered by the guards almost non-existent. Still, these worrisome thoughts were dispelled when Twilight heard another patrol of guards approaching. Inside, she ducked into an open door. Twilight didn't have time to shut the door without drawing suspicion, so she hid in the darkest corner of the room and prayed the guards wouldn't look in her direction. The sound of hoofsteps grew louder, and the guards soon stepped into view, but there was another pony with them. Twilight only saw the stallion from behind, but she recognized him all the same. It was Spell Nexus, the headmaster of Celestia's School for Gifted Unicorns, and Twilight could only panic and wonder why he was in the castle. Had he been pony-napped? Was he being held captive? Did Nightmare Moon want to torture him for information? Despite the danger to herself, Twilight also saw an opportunity. If she set him free, he could go tell the princesses where Nightmare Moon was. That way they could prepare and plan an attack against the castle. He was also a unicorn with a talent for magic, and that meant he might be able to wield the element of magic in her place. He could possibly complete the elements of harmony, since Twilight doubted she'd be leaving the castle when she found Nightmare Moon. So, with only the vaguest thoughts of a plan, Twilight jumped back into the corridor. Her horn glowed, and with a resounding clang she used her magic to smash the helmets of the two guards together. The blow wasn't enough to knock the guards out, but they slumped to the floor in a daze. That was enough for Twilight. She wrapped her magic around Spell Nexus and then broke into a gallop as she dragged him away from the guards. For 5 minutes Twilight ran, doing her best to put as much distance as she could between herself and the guards. It was only when she was satisfied that she wasn't being followed that she came to a stop and released Spell Nexus from her levitation magic. She then glanced back and smiled at Nexus. He had his eyes shut at first, but upon looking at them, Twilight found his slate-gray eyes filled with confusion. Twilight Sparkle?
Don't worry,
Twilight said as she turned away from him and poked her head around a nearby corner.
I don't know why you were pony-napped, but you don't have to worry. I can get you out of here.
But Miss Sparkle, what in the world are you doing down here? Spell Nexus asked. How did you even find this place?
My friend Pinkie Pie figured out that a pony in Ponyville named Hort Cuisine was a part of this crazy cult,
Twilight explained quickly.
So I used a scrying spell on some of his things and saw him moving towards the gemstone quarries before he suddenly disappeared. I assumed that the reason my spell stopped working was that something was blocking it, so I decided to investigate the quarries. From here, I made my way to the Diamond Dog mines and eventually found my way here.
Nexus stepped closer to Twilight. But how did you get past the guards?
Oh, that was easy, Twilight replied. She was still looking around the corner to make sure no guards were coming. I know a teleportation spell, so I just popped by the guards whenever I needed to. That's actually how I plan to get you out of here. Once I'm sure the coast is clear, I'll teleport us up to a balcony. There I can teleport us down to a cavern entrance. You'll have to find your own way back up from the surface from there, but I'm sure you can manage.
Oh, I can assure you, Miss Sparkle, Spell Nexus replied, his voice taking on a haughty tone. That won't be necessary. What do you mean by thunk?
Twilight felt something firm strike the back of her head, and the world fell away in an instant. Behind her, Spell Nexus frowned, lowering the hoof he had just used to strike Twilight. Nexus then lifted his head, and then his eyes shifted back to a turquoise color, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Guards!" Nexus' bellow brought 3 pairs of guards running, including the pair that had been attacked by Twilight. Nexus looked at each pair of guards, and pointed to them in turn. "You two, take her to the dungeons, and if she resists, don't be gentle. You two, go fetch the best unicorn sorcerers we have, and tell them we need to expand the defensive spells. The anti-scrying spell needs to include Ponyville. And you two," Nexus said, pointing a hoof at the 2 guards who were supposed to be protecting him. "Be thankful I need you for something. Otherwise you'd be in the dungeon for letting yourselves get off but guard like that. Now I want you to go and alert all of the soldiers in the tunnel to be on the lookout for the bearers of the elements of harmony. I do not want to be surprised if her friends decide to show up." The 3 pairs of guards all snapped to attention, and quickly saluted before going about their tasks. Nexus chose to follow the guards, but he carried the unconscious Twilight as a smile spread onto his lips. "You shall be presented to the Queen in time, Twilight Sparkle. But first, I need to hear how you do that lovely little teleportation spell of yours. Can't have other unicorns like you sneaking into the palace now, can we?" The pair of servants at the entrance of the throne room pushed open the large doors, and quickly bowed as Nightmare Moon stepped through. She had been returned to the frightful image so many ponies know her by. She once again had on her purple eyeshadow, and was clad in regal armor. All that was missing was her cutie mark, and that was a detail that perturbed Nightmare Moon to no end. She was a full-grown Alicorn queen,
and she still had a blank flank. Nexus had offered an explanation that her original cutie mark was actually Luna's, and now that she was her own mare, she might have a different special talent. Nexus then, of course, went about quickly flattering Nightmare Moon endlessly. He was certain her cutie mark would be a crown or something similarly regal, and would appear when she took her rightful place as the Queen of Equestria. These words eased Nightmare Moon's concerns, but did not remove them. For the moment, however, she let them simmer on the back burner of her mind as she approached her throne. Nexus was standing nearby, and wore a smile that she found unsettling. He seemed too happy, too eager, and she could only wonder what had put him in such a good mood. My queen, you are looking positively radiant in your new armor. Spell Nexus complimented as Nightmare Moon settled into her throne. Thank you, Spell Nexus. The blacksmith you recruited does fine work. The finest, my queen. You deserve nothing less. Nightmare Moon rolled her eyes. Save your flattery, Nexus, and tell me if there is anything else you wish for me to attend to today. There is but one matter, your highness. Spell Nexus answered as his smile grew as large as it could. And it's some good news. Nightmare Moon arched an eyebrow. News? Bring her in, Nexus called. At his beckoning, a set of doors to the side to the side of the throne room opened, and a pair of guards came trotting in. They dragged between them a limp body, which they then deposited onto the floor just below Nightmare Moon's throne. She was found sneaking around the castle corridors, and it appears that she came up here alone, Spell Nexus explained. A rather stupid thing to do, considering she is supposed to be the smartest one in her group of friends. Nexus chuckled at his own insult, but Nightmare Moon remained as still as stone. The breath was caught in her chest, and her eyes were fixed on the battered figure on the floor below her. It was Twilight Sparkle, and she looked like she had been on the losing end of a hoof fight. Her mane and coat were a mess, and she was covered in small nicks and scratches. Her right eye was also puffy and swollen, like she had been hit in the face. Stand before your queen, Nexus barked, using magic to lift Twilight off the ground. The sudden movement seemed to snap Twilight out of her stupor, and she attempted to struggle. Nexus saw this, and with a small magic, he released Twilight from his magic. This let Twilight flop down to the floor, and she whimpered in pain from the hard landing. Still, after a few moments, Twilight struggled to her hooves, though, even when she was standing, she kept her right front leg elevated, since putting her weight down on it appeared to cause her pain. So, how do you wish to have her dealt with, my queen? Nexus asked eagerly. I could only imagine some of the tortures you would inflict upon her. Oh, and then after you've had her fun, perhaps a beheading? Or maybe it would send a more powerful message to have her hanged. Nightmare Moon's tone was flat and cold. Leave us. Leave us. Pardon, my queen? Nexus asked, caught off guard by his queen's command. Leave us. Nightmare Moon seethed before focusing her enraged glare on Nexus. No other pony is to be in this room except me and Twilight, and no pony is to enter until I call for you. Of course, Nexus stammered before quickly galloping away. He called out to all the ponies in the room, telling them to leave, even though many of them heard Nightmare Moon's command for themselves. It took but a minute for the room to clear, and Nexus was the last to leave. He slipped out the front entrance and pulled it shut behind him, then set the locks with a loud click. Only then, when Nightmare Moon was sure she and Twilight were alone, did she make a move. She rose from her throne and spread her wings wide. Her shadow fell across Twilight, who took an anxious step back as terror glinted in her unarmed eye. What are you doing here? Nightmare Moon asked, her voice dripping with hatred and paranoia. "Have you come to try and purify me as you did before? Have you come to use the elements of harmony to save Equestria? Have you come to destroy me?" Twilight shrank away from the imposing alicorn before her and flattened her ears against her head. I... Nightmare Moon slammed a hoof against the floor and bent her head down to Twilight's eye level. "Why are you here?"
"I came to say I'm sorry."
Twilight spat out as quickly as her mouth would allow. Twilight's words echoed hauntingly across the hall, and Nightmare Moon remained as still as stone. She simply stared at Twilight for a time, but then she stepped back, folded her wings, and sat back down on the throne.
"It is too late for apologies, but—"
"Don't try to lie to me," Nightmare Moon snapped. "I can see through your charade. Celestia came to visit. You two talked in private, and then she came to the library kitchen. She spoke sweet words about wanting me to see a doctor, just to make sure I was healthy, and how I could spend the night in the palace and even see your old room at her school. Of course I was naive enough to believe her, but you knew what was going on. You knew, and that's why you couldn't even look at me when she was taking me out the door. You conspired with her against me, just as you do now. You knew what she was going to do, and you did nothing to stop her."
"Please, Nix, I'm so sorry," Twilight said.
She took a careful step forward and looked at Nightmare Moon with her one good eye, since the other was still swollen shut. "My name is not Nix. It is Nightmare Moon."
"You can call yourself whatever you want. Nightmare Moon, Queen Moon, Empress of Equestria. You'll always be Nix to me,"
Twilight said, her voice taking on a comforting tone. Yet the comfort Twilight tried to offer only made Nightmare Moon's gaze harden. "Oh, how so very sentimental of you, Twilight Sparkle. Pity that sentiment wasn't there when Celestia was taking me away. Though, think about it. You probably wanted her to take me away."
"No, Nix, I didn't."
"Do not spew your lies here," Nightmare Moon interrupted with a bellow. "You saw who I was. You saw the truth, and no matter how much you denied it, you were scared of what I had become. So you let Celestia take me away, so you could forget about me and go back to your happy little life. Go get back and pretend. Pretend like I was never even there."
"I was scared, I'll admit it,"
Twilight said, trying to defend herself. She took another anxious step closer to Nightmare Moon.
"Princess Celestia was scared too, and she could convince me that I had to let her take you, so that you could be tested. She just wanted to be sure that you wouldn't be a threat to Equestria. Princess Celestia never meant to take you away forever."
Nightmare Moon flicked her gaze away from Twilight and spoke with a voice cold and uncaring, yet strangely quiet.
"Those are sweet lies, and nothing more." "No, Nix, it's the truth," Twilight assured. "I didn't want Princess Celestia to take you, so I heard you call out to me, and I tried to stop the princess. I ran out after the library door after you two, but the chariot was already gone. I wanted to stop it, Nix. I did."
"A touching story, but that's all it is," Nightmare Moon snipped coldly. "No matter what your intentions were, it was your actions that set all of this in motion. It is through your actions that have done ill against me, and it is through your actions for you will receive no forgiveness. And do not think I have forgotten the stream of lies you have filled my head with," Nightmare Moon continued. "After the spring play, you said I was not Nightmare Moon, that I could never be her. Well, if that was true, I wouldn't be sitting here now would we? Now that I think about it, I have to wonder if that lie was more for your own sake. You were just trying to deny the truth that stared you in the face, weren't you?" Twilight shook her head.
It wasn't a lie, Nix, and it still isn't a lie. Or at least, it doesn't have to be.
Nightmare Moon fixed Twilight with a contempt-filled glare. You are truly in denial when you can look upon me as I am and not see me as Nightmare Moon. Nix, ponies choose who they want to be, Twilight insisted, her voice laced with desperation. We all have that choice, and so do you. You are only Nightmare Moon if you want to be, and my Nix wouldn't want to be doing any of this. She wouldn't want to take over Equestria or make her friends worry.
A disheartened chuckle escaped Nightmare Moon's lips.
Worry? Now that is your cruelest joke yet, Twilight Sparkle. No pony is foolish enough to worry about me.
Really? Because I can think of 3, Twilight said firmly as she took another step forward. 3 crusaders who were your closest friends. A memory flashed in Nightmare Moon's mind, of Scootaloo staring up at her. Scootaloo had been the one pony in the crowd besides Twilight who hadn't looked at her in fear the night the resurrection spell was complete. Her eyes had been filled with concern, confusion, sadness. Nightmare Moon huffed through her nose and looked away from Twilight, for she was unable to bear the sight of her pathetic, pleading eyes anymore. They will need to learn that their friend is never coming back, and that she's gone forever.
She doesn't have to be, Twilight argued. Nix, you don't have to be.
Enough! Nightmare Moon screeched, the command punctuated by her wings unfurling. Still, Nightmare Moon caught her outburst. She took a deep breath, refolded her wings, and settled back into her throne. She then looked past Twilight to the throne door. Nexus! Guards! Spell Nexus and 2 guards slipped into the room within seconds of being called, and galloped up to the throne and bowed to their queen. What are your orders, your highness? With Twilight Sparkle in our custody, there is no threat posed by the elements of harmony. Celestia and Luna are defenseless, Nightmare Moon said proudly as she raised her head high. Now we must simply wait for the prime opportunity to strike against the royal sisters. No, Twilight said as a look of panic grew onto her face. It was the look of a pony whose desperate gambit had failed, whose last hope had been seized from her grip. It was an expression Nightmare Moon couldn't bear to look at, and she instead focused her gaze on Spell Nexus. Soon I will fly to Canterlot to take the kingdom, but for this day I will retire to my chambers and rest. Nexus deepened his brow to the point where his nose was almost touching the floor. Of course, your highness. And what would you have me do with Twilight Sparkle? You have done quite enough already, Spell Nexus. Nightmare Moon seethed, her words dripping with her disappointment. The harsh tone of his queen's voice caused Nexus to raise his head with a look of confusion painted across his face. Your Majesty? Nightmare Moon once again stood up and unfolded her wings. Only this time she was casting a dark shadow across Spell Nexus, causing him to cower where he stood. Do you, at all, recall my orders? Your Majesty, Let me refresh your memory, Nightmare Moon snapped, cutting him off. I told you that if any of the bearers of the elements of harmony were found, they were to be captured unharmed, and Twilight Sparkle brought directly to me immediately. Your Highness, you must understand. Silence, fool! Nightmare Moon bellowed. I gave you one simple order, and you failed to follow in spirit or letter. Give me one single reason why I shouldn't have your head for this. My queen, Spell Nexus stuttered,
He grappled with his words, trying to defend his action. When he was unable to do even that, he dropped to the floor and bowed as low as he could. "Forgive me, your highness. I was only trying to act in your best interest. We needed to know how Twilight Sparkle snuck into the castle, but you would not tell us without persuasion. I beg you, have mercy." Nightmare Moon remained silent for a long time. She then huffed and turned, walking back to her throne. "I will forgive you for this grave sin you have committed, but if you can follow my next order to the letter and without fail." "Anything, your highness," Nexus said desperately. Nightmare Moon turned and sat in her throne, tucking her wings away carefully. "Twilight Sparkle is to be taken to the dungeon and given a cell of her own. Her injuries are to be tended to by the finest doctors we have available, given the same treatment you would to any of our own ponies. Ensure that she has a proper blanket and pillow. She is also to be fed properly while she is in our custody, not just bread and water. She is to be given real food, food you yourself would be willing to eat, Nexus." Nexus blinked in confusion before he began speaking. "But, your highness, she—" "Do you question my will, Nexus?" Nightmare Moon asked, her voice a deep rumble. "Twilight Sparkle has failed utterly. Her foolish ploy at sentimentality has crumbled, and in her failure she has ensured our victory. Now she poses as much threat to me as an ant, and I can deal with her at my leisure at a time of my choosing. Until then you shall follow my orders and treat her as I have directed, so that she is in prime condition for when I take my revenge. And if I discover that she's been harmed again by you or the guards, it will not be her hanging from the gallows. Do I make myself clear?" Twilight had paled and looked like she was on the verge of tears. Spell Nexus, on the other hoof, quickly scampered up to the throne and offered his queen another bow. "Of course, your majesty. I should never have doubted your wisdom. She shall be shown the utmost care, so that she can truly appreciate the pain you will in time inflict upon her. I will see to it personally." "Good," Nightmare Moon replied. "And to ensure that you will obey, here is a small taste of my wrath. I hope that you will remember it the next time you think to cross me." With that, a small bolt of lightning crackled from Nightmare Moon's mane and struck Nexus on his flank. He would have yelped in pain, but he bit back the cry and continued to bow. The bolt had left a small mark of singed hair, and though it had done no real damage, the expression on Nexus's face made it clear it was quite painful. The spot would undoubtedly be tender for days to come. Once the worst of the pain had subsided, Nexus had rushed off, intending to relay Nightmare Moon's orders to every pony in the castle. Nightmare Moon watched him leave, and only once Nexus was out of the room did she allow herself a few breaths to calm herself down. She then glanced over those ponies who were still in the room, 2 guards and Twilight Sparkle. "I am now retiring for the day," Nightmare Moon announced as she stood from her throne. Forcing herself to look straight ahead, she walked past Twilight and towards the throne room doors. "I expect you to escort Twilight Sparkle to her cell and ensure that everything I told Spell Nexus to do is done. Report to me directly if any pony has failed to obey my orders." "Yes, my queen," the 2 guards replied in unison before moving over to Twilight. While the pair tossed Twilight into the room like a sack of potatoes initially, the 2 guards were now handling her as if she was the most fragile thing in the world. They escorted her from the room, helped Twilight keep the weight off one of her hurt hoof, and did anything they could to keep Nightmare Moon from redirecting her anger to them. Nightmare Moon's anger had not cooled when she reached her bedroom. In truth, it had only reached a more violent boil as she thought about Twilight and Spell Nexus. She threw open the door to her bedchamber and slammed it down shut as soon as she had stepped inside. Then, for extra measure, Nightmare Moon took her bookcase and slammed it against the door, ensuring she would not be disturbed. Her solitude guaranteed, Nightmare Moon began to remove her armor. The armor was comfortable as armor could be. Still, With her patience worn thin by Twilight and Nexus, she could not stand to wear it any longer. She threw each piece against the nearby wall, letting the bits of metal form a cluttered pile on the floor. It was her attempt at venting some frustration, but it provided little relief. How dare she! Nightmare Moon seethed as she approached her vanity. On one side of the vanity, next to her makeup, rested a bowl, a pitcher, and a cloth. She poured the water from inside the pitcher into the bowl. Then she wet a cloth, and used it to remove her eyeshadow as she continued to rant to her reflection. How dare Twilight come to me to spew more of her lies? How dare she call me Nyx? Does she think I'm still an ignorant fool? Does she think I'd be swayed by her words again? I should have cut her down where she stood for her arrogance alone. And Nexus! Nightmare Moon seethed. She finished cleaning off her makeup, and tossed the rag into a waiting bowl. He is lucky his transgressions only earned him a sore flank. They are all forgetting who I am, she said to her reflection, but I'll make them remember. I'll show Twilight I am no longer the cowering filly she found, and Nexus will learn I am a man not to be trifled with. They will both learn that Celestia's fear of me and my potential was wise. The thought of Celestia made Nightmare Moon grit her teeth. And Celestia, she will learn all too well the depths of my wrath, both her and Twilight. Twilight for abandoning me, and Celestia for taking me away. They will both pay for... Nightmare Moon grunted, and before she could stop herself, she lifted her hoof and smashed it into the mirror. The surface cracked and spiderwebbed from her blow, and her reflection became fragmented and distorted from so dozens of reflections of her eyes were staring back at her. No, Nightmare Moon whispered, her eyes dripping with the venom of her anger. I do not care that I was taken away in the night. I do not care that I was stolen from my home and that Twilight did nothing. No, they will be judged for their true crimes against me. Celestia shall regret stealing me and the moon, and Twilight will pay for bringing the elements of harmony against me. They shall know no remorse, no mercy. I am Nightmare Moon, she told her splintered reflection, and they will pay for what they've done.